poor Margaret, she probably does not even know how she is going to pay the bills now," Vanessa said softly behind me at the funeral, as if I were not standing less than 6 feet away, as if grief had made me invisible, as if I had already faded into something small and manageable and easy to dismiss, and I remember the way the words settled into the silence around me, not loud, not cruel on the surface, just quiet enough to sound like concern to anyone who was not paying attention, but I was. Paying attention, I always had been, I just chose when to respond, and that day I chose not to. I stood beside my husband's casket, my hand resting lightly against the polished wood, the scent of lilies thick in the air, and I kept my face composed because after 42 years of marriage I had learned that dignity does not need witnesses to exist, it only needs discipline, and discipline was the only thing holding me steady as people passed by offering their condolences, their careful smiles, their gentle touches on my arm. All of it blending into a soft hum of sympathy that felt strangely distant, like I was watching someone else's life unfold from across the room. I saw Daniel standing near the back, his posture stiff, his eyes rarely meeting mine, and beside him Vanessa, poised and composed, her hand resting lightly on his arm as she leaned in to whisper something that made him nod without question, and I wondered when that had become their pattern, when my son had stopped thinking for himself and started moving in quiet agreement with her, but I did not ask, not then, because the answer would not have changed anything. Not anymore. The pastor's voice carried gently through the room, speaking about Robert's kindness, his work ethic, the life he had built, and I listened with a stillness that surprised even me, because beneath the grief there was something else beginning to take shape, something colder, something clearer, like a lens coming into focus after years of being slightly off, and I realized in that moment that I was not just losing my husband, I was seeing my family without illusion for the first time. I caught fragments of conversation as people moved around me, small comments spoken in low voices, about the house, about the future, about what would happen next, and each one carried the same quiet assumption that I was no longer in control of anything, that I would need help, that decisions would be made for me, and I let them believe it because correcting them would have required energy I was not willing to spend, not yet. Vanessa's voice drifted back to me once more, this time a little more confident, as she spoke to one of Robert's old colleagues about how difficult it would be for someone my age to manage such a large property alone, how it might be best to consider options, and I noticed the way she smiled when she said it, polite, measured, but just a little too certain, as if she already knew how the story would end, as if she had already written the next chapter without asking me if I intended to be part of it. I lowered my gaze then, not in defeat, but in decision, because there is a difference, one that people like Vanessa never seem to recognize, and as the final hymn began and the room filled with soft voices singing words about peace and rest, I felt something inside me settle into place, something firm and unshakable, and I understood with absolute clarity that they were not seeing me for who I was, they were seeing the version of me they needed me to be, fragile, dependent, easy to move aside. And that misunderstanding would be their greatest mistake, not because I would correct them immediately, but because I would not, because I would let it grow, let it deepen, let them build their expectations on a foundation that did not exist, and when the time came, I would not need to raise my voice or defend myself or prove anything at all, I would simply step aside and let the truth do what it always does when it is finally revealed. It would stand on its own, undeniable, and everything they believed about me would collapse quietly, just like that. They arrived exactly at 10 on Saturday morning, not early not late, just precisely on time, as if this visit had been scheduled with intention rather than care, and I watched from the kitchen window as Daniel stepped out of the car, first his shoulders slightly tense, his eyes scanning the house before Vanessa followed, smoothing her coat and adjusting her expression into something soft and appropriate for the occasion. I opened the door before they could knock and Vanessa stepped forward with a gentle smile, her voice lowered as if the house itself required quiet. "We thought we could help you start sorting things out today," she said, and I nodded, stepping aside to let them in because resistance would have disrupted the rhythm they had already prepared, and I was not here to disrupt, I was here to observe. They moved through the house slowly, at first commenting on how well everything had been kept, how beautiful the space still felt, but there was something underneath their words, a quiet evaluation, a measuring of rooms, of space, of possibility, and I let them walk ahead of me as Vanessa paused in the living room, her gaze lingering on the furniture, the layout, the windows, as if she were imagining it rearranged, and I took a seat in my usual chair, not to rest but to watch. Daniel cleared his throat and sat across from me, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together in a way that reminded me of when he was younger, asking permission for something he already knew he wanted. "Mom, we have been thinking about what might be best for you going forward," he began, and I did not answer right away. I simply looked at him, giving him the space to continue because people reveal more when they are not interrupted. Vanessa stepped in smoothly as if this moment had been rehearsed. This house is beautiful, but it is a lot to manage, especially now. We just want to make sure you are comfortable and not overwhelmed. Her tone was careful, balanced between concern and suggestion, but the direction was already clear, and I folded my hands in my lap, considering my response not emotionally but deliberately, because this was not about convincing them of anything, it was about confirming what I already knew. "What are you suggesting?" I asked quietly, and Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with Daniel before answering. "Maybe it is time to think about something smaller, something easier, maybe closer to us where we can help more." And there it was, not sudden, not sharp, but placed exactly where it had been leading all along. I nodded slowly as if I were considering the idea for the first time, letting the silence stretch just enough to make them believe I was uncertain. Daniel relaxed slightly, his shoulders easing as if my lack of resistance had already begun to reassure him, and Vanessa continued, gently outlining options, mentioning communities, describing convenience, speaking in a way that framed the future as something they were offering rather than something they were taking. And I let her speak because every word confirmed the pattern, every detail reinforced the clarity I had been building since the funeral. When she finished, I stood and walked toward the hallway, gesturing lightly. "We can look through some things upstairs if you would like," I said, and they followed without hesitation because they believed the conversation had moved forward in their direction. But as I led them through the house, I was not thinking about what I might lose. I was thinking about how easily they had revealed themselves once they believed I would not push back, and in that realization I felt something settle even deeper, not doubt, not confusion, but certainty, the kind that does not rush or demand, it simply waits, knowing that the more freely they continued, the less I would need to say when the moment came to answer. Upstairs the air felt different, quieter, more contained, as if the rooms had been holding their breath for longer than I realized, and I watched as Vanessa stepped into the bedroom first, her eyes moving slowly across the furniture, the closet, the windows, measuring without touching, while Daniel lingered near the doorway, his hands in his pockets as if unsure where to stand in a space that used to belong to both of us. I walked past them and opened the closet door, pulling out a small box from the top shelf, the same box Robert had placed there years ago without explanation, and for a moment I let my fingers rest on the lid, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because some things are not opened until the moment demands it, and this was not that moment yet. I set the box gently on the dresser and turned back to them. Vanessa smiled lightly. "We can start with clothes, maybe separate what you want to keep and what could be donated. It might make things easier later," she said, and I nodded as if the suggestion were practical, as if this were simply about organizing rather than preparing. And I moved to the dresser, opening the top drawer, slowly taking out a folded sweater, placing it on the bed, not because I intended to sort it, but because movement keeps people comfortable. It gives them the illusion that progress is being made. Daniel stepped closer then, his voice quieter than before. "We just want to make sure you are taken care of, Mom. You should not have to deal with all of this alone." And I looked at him for a moment, not long enough to challenge him, but long enough to see the distance between what he was saying and what he believed, because care does not sound like direction, it does not arrive already decided. And I placed the sweater down beside me, smoothing it carefully as if the action required my full attention. "I understand," I said simply, and that seemed to reassure him. Vanessa moved further into the room, now opening the second closet door, her expression shifting slightly as she looked inside at the neatly arranged rows of jacket, shoes, boxes, each one placed with intention over the years. And I noticed the pause, the brief flicker of something that was not sympathy but curiosity, something that calculated value. Without speaking it aloud, "There is a lot here," she said lightly, and I allowed myself the smallest nod, because acknowledgement often encourages more than resistance ever could. She turned then, leaning slightly against the doorframe. "Have you thought about where you might go if you decide to move somewhere smaller? We could help you look. There are some really nice places not far from us." Her tone was still gentle, still framed as help, but the assumption beneath it had grown stronger, more confident, and I stepped back from the dresser, closing the drawer slowly as if finishing something important, though nothing had been decided at all. "I have not made any decisions yet," I said, and for the first time there was a slight shift in the room, not confrontation, not tension, but a pause where certainty had expected agreement. Daniel glanced at Vanessa quickly, and she recovered just as fast, smiling again. "Of course, we just want to be prepared when you are ready," she replied, and I nodded once more, allowing the conversation to settle into something neutral, because the moment did not require correction, it required continuation. I picked up the box from the dresser and placed it back on the shelf, closing the closet door with quiet precision, and as I turned away I felt the weight of everything becoming clearer, not heavier. just clearer, because what they were doing was no longer hidden behind kindness or timing. It was visible, structured, intentional, and in that clarity there was no confusion left, only patience, because the more freely they spoke, the more completely they revealed themselves, and the less I would need to do when the time came to show them exactly what they had failed to understand all along. After they left that afternoon, the house felt quieter than before, not because it was empty, but because something had been confirmed, and once something is confirmed, it does not echo the same way anymore. I walked back into the bedroom, slowly closing the door behind me, and for a moment I stood there looking at the closet where the box still rested on the top shelf untouched and exactly where it belonged. I did not reach for it yet, because timing matters more than possession, and I had already decided that nothing inside that box would be revealed until it served a purpose beyond explanation. I moved through the room, picking up the sweater I had placed on the bed earlier, folding it again with careful precision, returning it to the drawer, and not because I needed order, but because I was choosing what remained within my control and what did not. I went downstairs then and sat at the kitchen table where the sunlight was beginning to fade across the surface, the same table where conversations had once felt shared and now felt staged, and I allowed myself to replay the morning, not emotionally but analytically. The pauses, the glances, the way Vanessa had stepped in before Daniel could finish a sentence, the way Daniel had looked to her before agreeing to anything, even something as simple as a suggestion about sorting through belongings. It was no longer subtle, it was structured, and once something becomes structured, it can be predicted, and once it can be predicted, it can be redirected. I reached for the notepad by the phone and wrote down a few simple things, not plans, not yet, but observations, because clarity begins with seeing things exactly as they are without adding weight or interpretation, just facts. Vanessa leads, Daniel follows, decisions are framed as help, outcomes are assumed before discussion, and as I looked at those words, I felt no anger, no urgency, just a steady understanding that I was no longer part of their narrative. I was the obstacle they intended to manage, and that realization did not weaken me, it simplified everything. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the empty driveway where their car had been just an hour before, and I imagined the conversation they were having now, perhaps in the car, perhaps later at home, the quiet confidence that comes when people believe things are moving in their favor, and I let that image settle because it would serve me later, not as motivation but as confirmation that they would not be cautious, they would not slow down, they would continue forward exactly as they had begun, which meant I would not need to push anything at all. I would only need to step aside at the right moment. I turned back toward the hallway, and for the first time since the funeral I allowed myself a small decision, not about the house, not about moving, but about direction. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had not used in months, listening to the steady tone before the call connected, and when the voice on the other end answered, I did not explain everything. I simply said, I think it is time we review what Robert put in place. There was a brief pause and then a calm response, of course, Margaret, I have been expecting your call, and I nodded even though he could not see me, because that was exactly what I had begun to understand as well. None of this had happened suddenly, none of this was unexpected, at least not for everyone, and as I hung up the phone I felt something settle fully into place, not a reaction, not a defense, but a decision. Because from this point forward I would not be observing without action, I would be preparing, and the difference between those two things is where everything begins to change. The meeting was set for Monday morning at 10, and I arrived 5 minutes early, not out of habit but out of intention, because being early allows you to see things before they are arranged, and I preferred the room before it was prepared, before the tone was set by anyone else. Mr. Henderson greeted me with the same calm professionalism he had always carried, a man who had known my husband for decades and who understood that silence often held more meaning than conversation. We sat across from each other at a long polished table, the same one where Robert had signed documents years ago, documents I had never needed to question until now, and as I placed my hands gently in my lap I noticed how steady they were, not from confidence but from clarity, because uncertainty is what creates hesitation, and I no longer felt uncertain. I assume you have noticed the shift, he said quietly, not as a question but as a recognition, and I nodded once because there was no need to explain what had already become obvious. He opened a folder in front of him and turned it slightly so I could see the contents, lines of legal language, structured, carefully precise and deliberate, the kind of writing that does not allow for interpretation, only outcome. Your husband anticipated potential complications, he continued, his voice even measured. He made certain decisions to ensure that you would never be placed in a position where others could control what belongs to you. I listened without interruption because this was not new information, it was confirmation, and confirmation is what transforms instinct into fact. He pointed to a section on the page outlining the trust, its structure, its conditions, the protections built into it, and I read each line slowly, not because I did not understand but because I wanted to feel the weight of it, the finality of what had already been decided long before anyone else began making assumptions. The house is not directly transferable, he added, and any attempt to pressure or manipulate your living situation would activate a clause that restricts access entirely. I leaned back slightly, taking in the words not with surprise but with a quiet sense of alignment, because everything I had observed, everything I had written down, everything I had allowed to unfold without resistance was now reflected here in language that could not be dismissed, could not be argued, could not be softened by intention. And the financial accounts? I asked, my voice steady, and he nodded, turning another page. The majority is secured under your authority alone, with additional conditions in place should any beneficiary attempt to interfere with your autonomy. He paused, then watching me carefully as if waiting for a reaction, but there was none, not the kind he might have expected. No relief, no visible emotion, just a slow measured breath as I absorbed what had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. I closed the folder gently, not as an ending but as a decision, and for the first time since the funeral I allowed myself to understand the full scope of what they had misjudged, not just my position but my awareness, because they believed they were guiding the outcome. They believed I would follow the path they had outlined without question, without resistance, and that belief had given me everything I needed, not to fight, not to argue, but to wait. And now the waiting had purpose. As I stood to leave, Mr. Henderson asked quietly, would you like to proceed with any actions at this time? And I paused at the door, considering the question not as a matter of urgency but as a matter of timing. Not yet, I replied. I think it is important they continue exactly as they are. And as I stepped out into the morning light, I felt something settle completely into place, not anticipation, not anxiety, but readiness, because there is a moment when observation ends and direction begins, and I could feel that moment approaching with a certainty that required no announcement, only patience. By midweek their confidence had grown into something visible, something that no longer needed to be hidden behind careful wording or polite suggestions, and I saw it the moment they walked into the house again, this time without asking first. Vanessa moved through the living room with a familiarity that did not belong to her, yet pausing near the windows as if already deciding what would stay and what would change, while Daniel followed carrying a folder in his hand, his posture more assured than before, as if a decision had already been made somewhere beyond this room. I did not question their arrival, I simply watched as Vanessa turned toward me with a gentle smile that felt thinner now, less careful. We were thinking it might help to start making some real plans, she said, her voice steady, her tone confident, and I nodded slightly, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, because acknowledgement encourages continuation and continuation reveals everything. Daniel stepped forward, then opening the folder and placing it on the table. We looked at a few places nearby, some really nice communities, good support, easy maintenance. We thought maybe you could take a look, he said, sliding a brochure toward me filled with images of small, neat spaces, clean and contained environments designed for people who were expected to need less, to want less, to take up less space. And I picked it up, turning the pages slowly, not because I was considering it but because I wanted them to believe I was. Vanessa leaned slightly closer, her voice softer now, as if offering reassurance. It would be easier for everyone, and you would not have to worry about the house anymore. We could take care of everything here and there. It was not hidden, not softened, just placed directly into the space between us, as if it were the most natural progression in the world. I set the brochure down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table, and looked at them both, not searching, not questioning, just seeing them clearly for exactly who they were in this moment. Daniel avoided my eyes for a second, then met them briefly, as if reminding himself to stay steady, while Vanessa held my gaze without hesitation, because she believed she was guiding this, she believed I was following. You have already thought this through, I said quietly, and Vanessa smiled again, a little brighter this time, encouraged by what she assumed was acceptance. We just want what is best for you, she replied, and I let a small pause settle before responding, because timing shapes meaning more than words ever can. Of course you do, I said simply, and Daniel exhaled slightly, his shoulders relaxing as if a weight had just been lifted, and in that small release I saw it clearly. They believed the decision was moving forward. They believed I had reached the same conclusion they had planned all along, and I allowed that belief to remain untouched, because correcting it now would serve no purpose. It would only interrupt what was already unfolding exactly as it needed to. I stood then, smoothing my hands lightly against the table, not as a gesture of finality but as a quiet signal that the moment had shifted. Why do not we all sit down tomorrow evening and talk through everything properly, I suggested, and Vanessa nodded immediately. That sounds perfect, she said, her voice carrying a note of quiet satisfaction, while Daniel agreed just as quickly, and I watched them gather their things, the folder, the brochure, the small pieces of a future they thought they were constructing, and as they moved toward the door I felt no urgency, no need to accelerate or delay, only a steady certainty that the next conversation would not be like the others, because the moment they believed they had reached the outcome was the moment they would finally be ready to hear what had already been decided long before they ever stepped into this house with plans that were never theirs to make. The next evening arrived with a quiet stillness That felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself understood that something was about to shift, and I set the table as I always had, not out of habit but out of intention, placing each item with care: the plates, the glasses, the small details that once held meaning for family dinners that felt genuine. And when Daniel and Vanessa arrived, they carried the same calm certainty from the day before, the same quiet confidence that comes when people believe the outcome has already been decided. Vanessa stepped inside first, her smile warm, her tone light, as if this were just another conversation that would move smoothly in the direction she expected, while Daniel followed, setting the folder on the table again. Without hesitation, as if it already belonged there, we sat down together, and for a moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because they were waiting for me to begin to confirm what they believed I had already accepted. And I let that silence settle fully before I reached for the folder and opened it slowly, not to review it but to acknowledge it, because acknowledgement is often mistaken for agreement, and I allowed them that assumption just long enough for it to become comfortable. "You have both put a lot of thought into this," I said quietly, and Vanessa nodded immediately, leaning forward slightly, her voice soft but certain. "We just want to make things easier for you. This is about your comfort, your future." And I listened without interruption, because this was not the moment to challenge, it was the moment to conclude. I closed the folder gently and placed my hands flat on the table, aligning them carefully as I had done many times before when preparing to speak with clarity rather than emotion. "I agree that decisions need to be made," I said, and I watched the subtle shift in their expressions, the relief, the quiet satisfaction, the belief that the path they had laid out was now complete. And I let that belief settle completely before I continued, "But not the ones you think." And the room changed then, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough for the certainty they carried to pause. For the first time, Vanessa's smile held for a moment longer before fading slightly, and Daniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing just enough to show confusion rather than understanding. I reached beside me and placed a single document on the table, not a stack, not an explanation, just one page, because truth does not need to overwhelm, it only needs to exist clearly where it can be seen. Neither of them spoke as they looked down at it, reading slowly, their expression shifting not into anger, not into confrontation, but into something quieter, something less certain. As the words settled into place, the structure, the conditions, the clarity of what had already been established long before this conversation ever began: "The house is not available to transfer," I said calmly, not raising my voice, not adding emphasis, because none was needed, and any attempt to influence my living situation would result in immediate restriction of access to everything connected to it. Vanessa's hand moved slightly across the table as if to steady herself, not dramatically, just enough to reveal that this was not what she had expected, while Daniel looked up at me, then truly looked for the first time since the funeral, not past me, not around me, but directly at me, searching for something he had not considered before. "I do not need help deciding where I belong," I continued, my voice even, measured, "and I do not need anyone to manage what was never theirs to begin with." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of realization, the kind that does not argue, it simply replaces what was believed with what is real. And I stood then, not abruptly, not forcefully, just with the same quiet control I had carried from the beginning of this moment, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to defend. The truth had already done what it needed to do. I walked toward the door, opening it gently, and paused just long enough to say one final thing, not as a warning, not as a punishment, but as a statement that required no response. "You thought I was alone, but you never understood that I was prepared long before you decided I needed you." And with that I stepped aside, allowing them the space to leave the same way they had entered, believing they were in control. Only now they understood that they never had been at all.